This is the program Black Sky Stop Fake. My name is Svitlana Mialyk. Welcome to everyone who is with us today. Today we will talk about Europe's information front and how to counter Russian propaganda during the war, Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. My guest today is Anatolii Kurnosov, an analyst at the Doctrine Center for Political Studies, executive director of the European Dialogue Circle social organization, and an expert at the Ukrainian-Polish Media Platform. Welcome, Mr. Anatolii.
Good morning.
Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been waging not only a war with weapons, but also an information war, a war for minds, a war aimed at cities. In Poland, a partner and ally of our country, Ukraine, Moscow, is very actively trying to sow distrust towards Ukraine and Ukrainians, trying to divide society in some way to weaken support for Ukraine. Let's talk about how this disinformation machine works, how you see it as an expert and analyst of Polish-Ukrainian relations, and what can be done to prevent and counteract it. Let's start with this. What topics, in your opinion, does the Kremlin currently use most often to undermine Polish-Ukrainian relations?
Well, first of all, it is, of course, what we have been observing recently. The topic of Ukrainian refugees is being used very actively, and not only refugees, but Ukrainians in Poland in general. We can see how all negative situations are being exploited. And here it should be noted that, objectively, there are a number of negative phenomena. Recently, we have seen, and this happens regularly, how the Polish secret services and police detain Ukrainian citizens. Not only them, of course, but also them, who work for the Russian Federation and are involved in preparing various acts of sabotage, terrorist attacks, and so on. However, if you look at the overall number, and there are a lot of Ukrainians in Poland, compared to the population of a country like Latvia, for example, then overall it is not such a large percentage. However, these issues are very actively exploited, disseminated, publicized and fueled.
They are fueled, right?
They are fueled, yes.
Please tell me, who most often disseminates this information? Is it the media, as you see it? Is it bots, politicians, or perhaps some marginal groups?
Yes, bots are used very actively. Recently, the Polish side conducted research which shows that about half of the accounts spreading anti-Ukrainian sentiment are bots. Second issue. In the summer of 2023, my colleagues and I carried out the Stop Lie project, in which we researched and analyzed how Russian propaganda works in Germany and Poland. At that time, we were particularly interested in the influence of Telegram. At that point, there was a rather skeptical belief among the Polish public that Poles hardly ever use this messenger. However, we noticed a very clear pattern, a whole chain. First, the information appears in Russian language channels on Telegram and in Russian media reports. Then it is copied almost word for word, translated into Polish, and transmitted to Poland through Polish language channels on Telegram. After a while, it appears somewhere in the statements of individuals or experts, and eventually a similar narrative reaches the Polish media.
And then to politicians, right, Mr. Anatolii?
And then to politicians.
Because politicians are very sensitive to public opinion and very often play to the public.
Absolutely right. And when this narrative is repeated several times, it moves from the Russian channel and appears as even a single mention in the Polish media. It becomes, in a sense, legitimized in the Polish information network. Because if we say right away that it was published by the Russian media, then of course no one will pick it up. But when it is repeated by Polish experts, even in the form of questioning, it begins to take on a life of its own in the Polish information space. Such mechanisms are currently in use and, unfortunately, although more than 2 years have passed, in my opinion, this influence is only increasing.
I would like to ask if it is possible to trace how the tone and content of this anti-Ukrainian campaign in Poland has changed, especially since Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine began in 2022. Following this chain, how do you perceive it? To what extent has this disinformation campaign targeting Ukrainians in Poland deepened and expanded?
You see, it has simply gained more, let's say, momentum. The vast majority of these narratives about Ukrainians in Poland already existed before. They probably started to appear at the end of 2022, especially at the beginning of 2023. And by the summer, they were already evident. While preparing for our meeting, I reviewed what we wrote at the time, and we wrote both on the Ukrainian-Polish Media Platform and in Ukrainian and Polish. In fact, these narratives have not changed, but at the time they were considered quite marginal. And now, unfortunately, they are being repeated by more and more representatives of Polish society. Although I will repeat that some of these concerns are, of course, well-founded, related, among other things, to the fact that Polish society is wary of the large number of migrants who, according to many Polish experts, are not sufficiently familiar with Polish traditions and culture. A significant proportion of them use Russian in their everyday lives and attend concerts by Russian performers. And this, of course, worries society. All of this together, especially when combined with the fact that there is currently a growing sense of threat and the possibility of armed conflict in Poland, including with Russia, overlaps and intensifies, resonating with public sentiment.
Yes. In fact, Polish society is somewhat conservative, which is why all the examples you give are, to some extent, favorable to those who operate in the sphere of hybrid warfare, creating fake news, conducting disinformation campaigns, and so on. I would like to ask if there are any specific examples of disinformation or fake news that surprised you or moved you to some extent. I am referring to situations concerning Polish-Ukrainian relations. Were there any?
Well, the most recent example is probably the organized campaign on the night of September 9th to 10th, when about 20 Russian drones flew into Polish territory. The dissemination of information that these were not Russian drones, but Ukrainian ones, began at 11 p.m. That is literally at the moment when most of these drones were just approaching Poland. This clearly proves that these messages were prepared in advance and fed into the Polish information sphere ahead of time.
So this was a planned campaign?
Yes, absolutely. I am sorry to say that a significant proportion, I think that the figure was 38%, that 38% of online comments said they were Ukrainian drones. Here, our Ukrainian media also failed to verify the situation and reported that 38% of Poles believe this. In reality, this is not the case. This 38% is the percentage of accounts, a large proportion of which, I believe in this particular case even more than half, were bots. But at the same time, some Polish politicians and even Polish journalists who deal with this topic and have a fairly wide readership also began to question this fact. They suggested, what if, even if the Ukrainians did not launch them intentionally, the Ukrainian air defense system overlooked them? Maybe they didn't want to shoot them down. Or maybe, thanks to electronic warfare systems, they deliberately directed them towards Poland to draw it into the war. And so on. Such opinions are present, and this is probably the most striking example of how such events, how in parallel with an act of provocation or aggression, we can call it different things, a controlled media campaign is underway, even if it is introduced into the information field as a doubt rather than a firm conviction. Well, unfortunately, it works.
I would like to raise a historical issue. The historical issues between Ukraine and Poland are, in my opinion, fertile ground for Russian propaganda and disinformation, because this topic, in particular the Volhynia tragedy, called the Volhynia massacre in Poland, is a wound that has not yet healed, and from time to time bleeds more profusely, right? We can see that both countries are currently attempting to heal this wound, as the process of search and exhumation work has begun, and in my opinion, very actively, both in Ukraine and in Poland. I spoke recently with the Ukrainian ambassador to Poland, Mr. Vasyl Bodnar, and he also believes that this process is actively underway. We know that Ukraine has already issued a permit for searches in the village of Ugly, in the Rivne region. I also spoke with Ms. Karolina Romanovska, who also has high hopes that this process will begin soon and will continue. How effective or ineffective do you think Russian fake news, disinformation, propaganda, and stereotypes are currently in the sphere of historical relations between Poland and Ukraine, considering the whole situation and the cooperation between the two countries?
Well, first of all, I think it's a shame that we've lost some time. In my opinion, if this process had been actively launched by both sides back in 2022, I am not talking about the beginning of 2022, of course, as there was no time for that then, but let's say that from the end of 2022, this process could have started and should have been unblocked. Then, to a large extent, it would have contributed to anti-Ukrainian sentiments in Poland, not intensifying, because that's when the narratives began that Ukraine as a state is not responding sufficiently to the needs of Polish society, that in short, it is not grateful enough for the help it has received, that it cannot even bring itself to make such a simple gesture as unblocking the exhumations. Although in reality the matter is not so simple, and both Polish and Ukrainian law are quite similar in this regard. You can't just come to another country and carry out exhumation searches on the fly. You need the appropriate permits for this because it is a very sensitive issue. It also requires the participation of Ukrainian specialists if it takes place in Ukraine. These investigations are conducted by Ukrainian teams. There are not many companies that deal with this, nor are there many specialists, because the vast majority of them are currently involved in the war, serving in the military, or conducting searches related to our current losses. But yes, the Russian side is very actively exploiting this. For example, Professor Grzegorz Motyka, a well-known researcher of these tragic events, recently gave an example that as soon as the process of rapprochement between the Ukrainian and Polish sides began, such cases occurred twice. The FSB website published completely new documents concerning these events, which had not been published anywhere before. As soon as rapprochement begins, certain information is immediately released into the public domain in order to thwart it. So we can see the direct action of Russia and its secret services. However, I agree with you that fortunately, this process has begun and is continuing. Of course, it will not proceed as quickly as we would like. And winter is approaching. In winter, as early as December, and I think even from mid-November, when the first frosts and snowfall begin, this work will be practically impossible to carry out, and will probably only resume at the beginning of April. But until then, there is time for the Polish side to also find the funds and appoint the appropriate specialists, i.e., to create a team that will be able to come and work in these places from the beginning of spring.
Yes, because in reality, it is a bilateral process that requires the involvement of both countries. Ukraine has given its consent. If we take Ugly in the Rivne region as an example, Ukraine has given the green light. Now the ball is in Poland's court. As far as I know, Ms. Karolina Romanowska, who submitted a request to the President of Ukraine and all relevant authorities a year ago, says that the funds are already in place. And on the Polish side, there is a positive decision and a willingness to act to get this process started. By the way, regarding what you said, Polish society, in fact, does not delve into the subject of the exploration work and what is needed for it to a certain extent. When I came to Poland and the topic of history came up, everyone, regardless of social group, journalists, media people, historians, or ordinary citizens, asked, why doesn't Ukraine give its consent to the exhumation? I reply, to obtain this consent, applications are needed, and after the applications are submitted, other decisions are needed. So it is a multi-vector and multi-stage process. There is no clear-cut answer of yes or no. Unfortunately, the public does not go into details and is very sensitive to all the Russian propaganda and disinformation that imposes its opinion on them. Here, in my opinion, analytical and critical thinking is needed. You need to read more, visit specialist websites, listen to experts, observe, and draw analytical conclusions. I have a question for you. How do analytical centers, especially Ukrainian and Polish ones, work to combat Russian disinformation? What is Ukraine doing? What is Poland doing? Are there any joint projects? You mentioned earlier a project to combat disinformation, and I understand that it involves analyzing the experiences of Poland, the Czech Republic, and other countries. What are the current activities of analytical centers?
Analytical centers are active, but the problem is, let's say, their limited permanent institutional impact. Let me give you an example of our initiative and work. We have been dealing with this issue for practically 3 months. We have proposed cooperation to many Polish media outlets, for example, in the publication of our analysis, our vision, perhaps our research or individual materials.
Нашого бачення, можливо, наших досліджень, окремих наших матеріалів.
Unfortunately, of the many Polish media outlets we approached, only a few responded. Many of them did not even respond at all, neither affirmatively nor negatively.
Чи так, чи ні. Хоча не все так сумно.
Although not everything looks so pessimistic, there are examples of such cooperation, such as the Stop Fake project, which we are discussing now. So we can see these initiatives. But what is the problem? Probably how to translate this research into practical implementation, not only to study how propaganda works, but also how to counter it. And it is really difficult to counteract, especially at a time when not only traditional media, but also social media play a huge role. Recently, the deputy editor-in-chief of one of Poland's leading publishing houses raised this issue during the Common Future Congress. Every traditional medium is subject to certain legal frameworks and complies with standards, but influencing social media algorithms is very difficult. These algorithms are often configured to promote negative information and are largely uncontrolled by society or the state.
Дуже часто налаштовані на те, щоб розганяти більше, скажімо так, негативну інформацію, і вони
So the big problem lies in controlling who is behind these accounts, who is behind these social networks, what topics they pick up and disseminate, because this has a really huge impact. However, action can be taken here. I remember that a few years ago, our wonderful mutual friend, Paweł Bobovich, came to Kiev and gave an excellent lecture on crisis communication during events such as the grain crisis or border blockades. He proposed the creation of a bilateral media and expert center with the participation of journalists and experts from both sides who would monitor the situation on an ongoing basis and predict the onset of such crises, such as border blockades or grain spills, in order to respond to them in a timely manner and issue warnings. After all, a quick response and the ability to show the true picture of the situation at the right moment, the golden hour principle, when you can impose the correct, true narrative and thwart a hostile attack, is crucial. The proposals are there, the initiatives are there. The most important thing is to implement them.
Воно дуже важливо. Тобто пропозиції є, ініціативи є, головне їх втілити.
Так, я думаю, що дійсно ці спільні інформаційні
I think that these joint information initiatives between Poland and Ukraine will help strengthen trust between our nations and societies. I believe that these initiatives should not be isolated, but must have a wider reach, because the resources and efforts that Russia is putting into disinformation and anti-Ukrainian propaganda, especially in Poland, are enormous. We can see that a war for minds is underway, and here, of course, we must act together. Finally, Mr. Anatolii, please give some expert advice to all those who are watching and listening to us. How can we resist Russian propaganda and influence? Perhaps you could share your personal experience.
Російські вкиди на російські впливи, можливо, ваш особистий досвід.
You know, my personal experience is this. When I read something that really moves and provokes me, and this happens every day, especially on my smartphone, I put it down for at least 5 to 10 minutes. I don't write a comment or an angry response right away, and I certainly never resort to generalizations. This is a trap that they always try to catch us in. When hate starts from one side or the other, slogans like "those Ukrainians" or "those Poles" appear, and then critical thinking is turned off. That's why I would advise everyone to think 100 times about why a particular post was created and how it is supposed to influence you. Don't rush to react, but think critically. What are you reading? What are you sharing? What graphics are you posting? Because nowadays, many people, including Ukrainians and Poles, like to share content generated by artificial intelligence. You simply have to analyze it. Unfortunately, as practice shows, not everyone is capable of doing so.
Mr. Anatolii, thank you for the interview. I would like to remind you that the analyst at the Center for Political Studies, Doctrine, Executive Director of the European Dialogue Circle, and expert at the Ukrainian-Polish Media Platform, Mr. Anatolii Kurnosov, was a guest on today's programme, Black Sky Stop Fake. Svitlana Mialyk was with you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.